I'm John Strum, and this is Real Talk MS. It's August 20th, and we have a lot to talk about. As many of you have discovered through your own experience, getting an MS diagnosis is not always the quick, straightforward process we'd like it to be. I'll add here that we're about a month away from learning about updates to the criteria used to diagnose MS, and I'll be in Copenhagen attending ECTRIMS, the largest MS research conference in the world, to report on those updates as they're announced. But getting a diagnosis only happens when you and your doctor first recognize that something's going on. It might be a sudden vision issue, maybe it's unexplained tingling in an arm or leg, or maybe it's something more acute that gets your attention. A wide variety of signs could point to MS, but they could also point to other health conditions. Joining me to help us better understand the signs and symptoms of multiple sclerosis is the director of the Multiple Sclerosis and Neuroimmunology Center at Dell Medical School at the University of Texas at Austin, where she also leads the MS and Neuroimmunology Fellowship Program and the MS Imaging and Outcomes Research Laboratory, Dr. Leorah Freeman. But before we get to my conversation with Dr. Freeman, there are a few other things that you should know about. It may be time to dust off that box of masks that was left over from those scary days of the COVID-19 pandemic when we couldn't leave the house without one. Unfortunately, the U.S. is experiencing the highest levels of COVID viral activity that's been recorded during a summer surge since the CDC began publicly tracking this data in January 2022. The CDC measures COVID viral activity by analyzing the levels of virus found in wastewater. Now, emergency room visits, hospitalizations, and deaths due to COVID are all on the rise, although thankfully not at the same rate as infections. Maybe that speaks to the benefit of the COVID vaccines. Which brings us to some reassuring news from France, where a research team analyzed the relapse activity of more than 100,000 people living with MS after they had received a COVID vaccine booster. The researchers found that there was no increased risk of relapse after 1, 2, or 3 booster doses of the COVID vaccine. And this was true across most every subgroup, including people with MS who were younger than 50, those people who had MS for less than 10 years, and those people who were already on a disease-modifying therapy. In fact, the only subgroup whose members did experience an increased risk of an MS relapse were people who had experienced 2 or more relapses in the previous 2 years. You know, there's been a lot of speculation or just wrong information shared through social media that warns about the risks of an MS relapse following a COVID vaccination booster. The evidence from this large study demonstrates that all of that unfounded speculation is simply someone's opinion masquerading as fact. So please, don't be fooled. The next COVID booster, which has been formulated to address the highly contagious COVID variant that's making America sick right now, will be available in just a few short weeks. If you're living with MS, it's my hope that the evidence from this large study will encourage you to protect yourself and your family and get that booster. Now, if you'd like to review the details of this study, you'll find a link in today's show notes. Researchers at Stanford University and the University of California, San Francisco will lead a phase 1 clinical trial evaluating Indapta Therapeutics' cell-based therapy known as IDP-023 in people with progressive MS. The trial will evaluate the use of IDP-023 along with Ocrevus, and the research team will be focusing on identifying the biological effects of this combination therapy. IDP-023 is made up of a specific type of cell called, and I know you're going to like this, natural killer cells. I kid you not. Natural killer cells, or NK cells, are a type of immune cell that play an important role in keeping inflammation in check. These cells can also eliminate other cells that have been identified by a specific antibody. Now, there won't be any quiz afterward, but just in case you'd like to know, this process of having antibodies identify a cell that's then eliminated by natural killer cells, well, that process is called antibody-dependent cell-mediated cytotoxicity. The specific cells in IDP-023 belong to a rare subset of natural killer cells that have undergone modifications after coming in contact with a common virus called cytomegalovirus. After coming in contact with this virus, these NK cells lack a specific protein. And compared to your regular natural killer cells, these cells have an enhanced ability to kill the cells targeted by antibody-dependent cell-mediated cytotoxicity. The theory behind this clinical trial is that Ocrevus, which is a monoclonal antibody, will flag B cells, and the enhanced natural killer cells will boost the already potent effect of Ocrevus and take out those B cells. Now, if you think this is beginning to sound like the plot from a Quentin Tarantino movie, you aren't alone. These natural killer cells are also very good at recognizing virus-infected cells. So it's hypothesized that they may help to eliminate immune cells that are infected with the Epstein-Barr virus, which could prevent further MS progression. So there's a lot going on here. But as scientists continue to identify the mechanisms that drive inflammation and neurodegeneration, we can expect to see treatments designed to target these biological processes. IDP-023 is one such candidate, and we'll be watching and reporting on this potential step forward in developing next-generation therapies designed to stop MS. More than half the people living with MS fall at least once every 6 months. And falling is a dangerous double-edged sword. On the one hand, falling itself can lead to injury and even death. But even if that fall doesn't leave someone seriously injured, what it does leave them with is a fear of falling again. People who have experienced a fall and develop a subsequent fear of falling become less confident in their balance. They reduce their participation in activities. They grow physically weaker as a result of that reduced participation, which all actually increases their risk of falling again. It's a vicious cycle that can deliver dangerous health outcomes and negative quality of life outcomes. That's why a PhD candidate in the Translational Neuroscience program at Wayne State University's School of Medicine recently received a 2-year, $96,812 grant from the National Institutes of Health to study the fear of falling among people living with MS. This study involves focusing on the neural, motor, cognitive, and psychological factors underlying the fear of falling. And the project's ultimate goal is to break that vicious cycle, reduce falls, and increase physical activity among people with MS. The study will look at physical and behavioral characteristics associated with the fear of falling, like gait, balance, executive function, and anxiety, along with advanced MRI techniques to round out a comprehensive evaluation of all of the variable elements that contribute to a fear of falling. You know, there's plenty of evidence that shows physical activity is beneficial to everyone living with MS at every level of ability. But you miss out on those benefits if every step you take is accompanied by worry and fear. This study will hopefully lead to strategies and techniques that are designed to eliminate that worry and fear, and we'll keep you posted as this work gets underway. For my friends and listeners in Canada, I want to remind you that A&W's Burgers to Beat MS Day is taking place in just 2 days, on August 22nd, at A&W locations across Canada. For those of you living in Canada or those of you with plans to be in Canada this Thursday, A&W will donate $2 for every teen burger sold to support Canadians affected by MS. Canada has one of the highest rates of MS in the world. Every 2 hours of every day, someone in Canada is told, "You have MS." Since 2008, A&W has raised over $20 million to support research, programs, and services for Canadians living with MS. If you'd like to participate, but you don't want to wait until Thursday, or you don't happen to live in Canada, you can visit burgerstobeatms.ca and make your online donation today. And you'll find that link in today's show notes. Every single day, weekends and holidays included, 12 more Canadians are diagnosed with MS. It would be interesting to discover how many others aren't diagnosed but should have been, or how many others were originally misdiagnosed or perhaps waited years for a conclusive diagnosis. Deciphering the signs and symptoms of MS can be tricky. And joining me in a moment to help us better understand the signs and symptoms of MS is my guest, Dr. Leorah Freeman. As many of you have discovered for yourselves, getting diagnosed with MS can be tricky. Not everyone experiences the typical symptoms of MS, and some of these symptoms can mimic other conditions, making the diagnostic process even more difficult. Joining me to discuss some of the common signs and symptoms of MS is Dr. Leorah Freeman. Dr. Freeman is the director of the Multiple Sclerosis and Neuroimmunology Center at Dell Medical School, the University of Texas at Austin, where she also leads the MS and Neuroimmunology Fellowship Program and the MS Imaging and Outcomes Research Laboratory. Her research focuses on the development of data-driven approaches to predict and improve the long-term outcomes of people with MS. She's passionate about eliminating disparities in MS research and care, and routinely works with advocacy and community organizations to help people with MS thrive. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Freeman.
It's a pleasure to be with you, John.
So tell me, what are some of the common symptoms of MS, and what makes getting diagnosed so difficult?
So MS can cause a wide variety of symptoms, and often, two people with MS rarely have the same symptoms. MS can affect different parts of the central nervous system, the brain, spinal cord, optic nerves, and can lead to symptoms that range from visual symptoms such as vision loss or double vision to weakness, to numbness and tingling, balance issues, bowel, bladder issues. People also frequently experience a range of invisible symptoms with MS. Pain is one of them, fatigue, brain fog. So we really see just a wide range of symptoms in people with MS, and that really contributes to the challenges with diagnosis, because frequently these symptoms are not recognized as potentially being due to multiple sclerosis. And consequently, people are not referred for the right test at the right time.
How long can getting an MS diagnosis actually take?
Technically, a diagnosis could be obtained in a matter of days in some patients if people have typical presentation that's recognized by their doctors as potentially being due to MS, and the right test, usually an MRI, is ordered at the right time. Sometimes some patients can have a diagnosis in a matter of days after the onset of their first symptoms. But we can see wide variations. Again, because the symptoms differ from person to person, because doctors don't necessarily recognize the symptoms of MS, or because the signs that we see on MRI can be confused with other conditions. So we frequently see folks that have waited months, sometimes years, for a diagnosis.
While we're talking about diagnosis, I have a two-part question for you. First, can you explain what CIS is? And then, can CIS develop into multiple sclerosis?
So CIS stands for clinically isolated syndrome. And that's usually a term that we use to define the first episode, a first attack that's consistent, or typical for multiple sclerosis. Let's say inflammation of the optic nerve causing vision changes. And that's, we use a term when the full diagnosis of MS cannot be made based on the different findings. So if people have an initial event that's suggestive of MS, but they don't have all the brain lesions or spinal cord lesions that are typically seen with MS or are insufficient to make this diagnosis, then instead of calling it MS, we call it clinically isolated syndrome. And people who have CIS are at risk of later on developing definite MS, especially if there are other signs. So let's say they have some brain lesions, but not enough to reach a diagnosis. That can be a telltale sign that they have a high risk of developing multiple sclerosis.
So if someone receives a CIS diagnosis, is it possible that for them to prevent the onset of MS by beginning maybe a high efficacy disease modifying therapy, for instance?
Absolutely. Today, we do recommend that people with clinically isolated syndrome who have findings in the brain that are suggestive of multiple sclerosis are start on a disease modifying therapy. That's because starting a disease modifying therapy early can prevent the occurrence of a second episode, and it can also minimize the risk of future disability.
For many people, vision problems are often the first symptom of multiple sclerosis. What are some of the most common vision issues that individuals with MS might face?
So people can have inflammation and demyelination affecting different part of the brain or the optic nerve, and that can lead to different types of visual symptoms. When the optic nerve is affected, people have what we call optic neuritis that can lead to blurry vision, loss of vision, sometimes loss of color vision, like a gray veil in front of your eye, and often accompanied by pain that worsens with eye movement. Lesions that are in different parts of the brain, particularly the brainstem, can cause other types of visual symptoms. Double vision is common, difficulty coordinating the eyes, and also abnormal eye movements that we can call nystagmus.
Numbness or tingling in the face, arms, or legs is also one of the first symptoms experienced by people who are diagnosed with MS. How common is numbness and tingling in MS? And is there any treatment to relieve those symptoms while someone is still waiting for that diagnosis?
Yes, sensory changes is very common in people with MS. We see this routinely, and the symptoms vary from person to person. Some people can experience just numbness. An area feels numb, and usually we don't necessarily, have any treatment for isolated numbness. But for people who experience any kind of abnormal sensation, such as tingling, burning, electric sensation that can be painful, or like full-blown, neuropathic pain, we can recommend medication that can be helpful. So usually, people may have tried, Tylenol at home, ibuprofen, but those don't typically work. What works are medications that belong to other classes of drugs, usually anti-seizure medications or antidepressants, are effective on neuropathic pain and abnormal sensations. So medications like gabapentin, pregabalin, duloxetine are drugs that are commonly used by neurologists to try to address those debilitating symptoms. It's important to remember, for people to remember, that your doctor cannot see your pain. They cannot see what you feel. So it's really important to verbalize those sensations and to have a conversation with your doctor about ways to alleviate the pain or the abnormal sensations. So really engage in a conversation with your doctor because there are ways to get relief.
Waiting for that diagnosis is never easy. And I think someone who is going through that process of being diagnosed, it's not uncommon for them to experience feelings of uncertainty or fear. Can you recommend some strategies or resources that might help manage those feelings while someone is in this process of being diagnosed?
Absolutely. I feel for my patients who are going through this, particularly when we have to do multiple tests, and the process can sometimes be prolonged because the presentation is atypical or there are other things to assess or address initially. I think, the first step is really to, build that relationship with your doctor, ask your question, really understand the process. This can really help demystify the entire process of being diagnosed. Ask questions about the test, what they mean, what the timeline is, and to really understand what's going on, what's happening. I would say that some people really benefit from learning about MS during this pre-diagnosis period. A lot of people have, they don't know anyone with MS. They don't know what it's like. It can seem insurmountable. But today, MS, we have a lot of treatment. There's a lot of hope, for people with MS. And I think that it can be important for some people to connect with resources where they can learn about this disease, treatment options, how MS is managed. I often recommend, the National MS Society website, your podcast, really try to gain an understanding of this condition. It's important to know that for some people, learning as much as they can about MS can be stressful, and there's no right way of doing this. So if learning's good, then go for it and learn as much as you can. If learning is stressful, pause but make sure to ask your doctor the right question. I would say that another important step is also to make sure that you're surrounded by loved ones or have support from a counselor or mental health specialist to really be able to address your fears, uncertainty, anxiety. So if you're unsure about how to access a resource, mental health resources, ask your doctor or contact the National MS Society.
Fatigue is another common symptom of MS, affecting as many as 75 to 95% of all the people with MS. And experiencing MS-related fatigue is not the same as just feeling a little tired. How would you define MS-related fatigue, and why is it so common in multiple sclerosis?
So MS fatigue is an overwhelming and crushing form of tiredness that people who don't live with MS, I fear, cannot understand. I've been caring for people with MS for 15 years, and I do not know what it is like, but I can see it in my patients. And it's the most common invisible symptom of MS. And again, something to discuss with one's doctor. Now, to your other question, I don't know that I have an answer to that. Why is it so common in MS? I would say that there's a role played by inflammation and fatigue. We see fatigue even before the onset of MS in what we call the prodromal phase of MS. Other autoimmune and inflammatory conditions are frequently associated with fatigue as well. Sometimes when we start treating the inflammatory process with MS, people feel improvements in their fatigue. So there's a role for inflammation. There's also a role for how the brain adapts to MS and the presence of lesions. Researchers have shown that people who have MS fatigue often have to activate more areas in their brain than people who with MS who don't have fatigue. So that process needing to do more work to accomplish the same task may be due to the MS process that's occurring within the brain. Also, some researchers have looked for, lesion locations that could be directly related to MS fatigue, but I don't know that we have an answer for that yet.
Are there medications available to manage fatigue? And are there alternative strategies or lifestyle modifications that can be used to manage fatigue?
So managing fatigue is extremely challenging. It usually is a multi-step process. I usually start with looking for worsening factors. Are there issues with the thyroid or sleep apnea or mental health, depression that can worsen fatigue? It's super important to first address those worsening factors. So that's step number one. Then after that, we can start having a conversation about what it takes to treat MS primary fatigue. In some cases, we might use medication, though there are no FDA-approved medications for the treatment of fatigue in MS. We may use off-label medications that have been developed for other conditions, such as amantadine that was developed for Parkinson's disease, modafinil for narcolepsy, and in some patients, these medications may be helpful. Again, this is a conversation between a person and their doctor. I always recommend lifestyle modification for the treatment of fatigue. It's extremely important to first optimize sleep, rest, and recovery. So being able to, have a good sleep hygiene, sleep routine, sleep schedule is step number one, usually not enough. Then engaging in exercise can seem counterintuitive, but it's really beneficial for fatigue. And people can use lower impact forms of exercise, yoga, water exercises, for example. Finally, it's key to use energy saving strategies. It's important for people to know what matters to them, what are the activities that truly matter to them, so that they can find ways to either delegate or spend less energy on some of the other activities. Like if you don't love going to the grocery store, then don't shop online, have it delivered. So there are ways now, and especially in this post-COVID world, there are ways for us to not choose and expend all of our energy doing things we don't want to do, but focus on the things and the people that matter.
Spasticity is one more MS symptom that can be physically limiting and even painful. So what is spasticity and how common is it in people living with MS?
So spasticity is a feeling of stiffness or spasms that are related to demyelination or nerve damage along the motor pathways in the brain or spinal cord. And it can manifest in mild cases as just occasional tightness or spasm, but in more severe cases, it can be full-on, stiffness of the leg or arm or hand, and be very painful for some people living with MS.
Are there specific triggers that might make spasticity worse?
Absolutely. Rapid movements can make spasticity worse. So, don't stretch the limbs too quickly. It's important to relax the limbs slowly because those rapid movements can make spasticity worse. Also, environmental factors like humidity, extreme temperatures can worsen spasticity. Infections and fevers are a frequent cause of worsening. Also, something that people don't talk much about is the role of constipation in worsening spasticity, and important to treat that constipation to help people with their other symptoms.
And what might happen if spasticity is left untreated?
Well, if you don't treat spasticity, people can, at the very least start experiencing pain or disruption of their sleep or their activity, because of the spasms, or pain of the related to spasticity. We can see gait impairment caused by spasticity that can lead to falls, which can then lead to fractures and other complications. Also, severe spasticity can lead to difficulty mobilizing joints that can cause long-term deformation of the joint.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. Dr. Leorah Freeman, thank you for all you do to improve the lives of people living with MS. And thanks so much for talking with me today.
My pleasure to be with you, John. Thank you for spreading knowledge and hope.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society. And you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/364. You'll find that link in today's show notes, so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. And if you have a minute, I hope you'll pay a visit to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free Real Talk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of Real Talk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes. And it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.